Before we write into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. Heat makes everything louder in Vietnam. Boots in gravel, breath in throat, even the tiny click of a radio handset, and the jungle listens back. The radio operator in the 173rd Airborne didn't even get to finish his sentence. Eagle 6, this is Bravo 2, taking fire from the tree line approximately 200 meters north of LZ Papa, requesting immediate. The transmission didn't cut off because he stopped talking. It cut off because someone else had been listening. 300 meters out, somewhere in the green seam where trees met sky, a North Vietnamese sniper had been doing math. Not with numbers on paper, but with angles, wind, distance, and the simple geometry of a 10-foot antenna reaching above the brush like a flagpole. The round hit the radio man dead center, high chest, hard enough to fold him backward like the jungle had yanked him by the collar. The antenna shivered. The handset fell. The air filled with the kind of silence that only happens when a unit realizes the one thing connecting them to the outside world just got turned into a corpse. 5 seconds. That was the number they threw around in training, half as a joke, half as a prayer. 5 seconds of life expectancy if you were carrying the PRC-77 with its proud, stupid whip of metal announcing you to everyone who mattered. Some optimists said 30. Either way, everyone knew the truth. If you carried the radio, you didn't just carry equipment, you carried a target. But what they didn't tell those young radio operators sweating under 54 pounds of gear wasn't that the antenna made you visible. It was that your voice made you legible. Because the real danger wasn't a line of metal above the treetops, it was what went up the air with your words. Out there in a triple canopy hell called Phuoc Toi province, an entirely different set of soldiers had been proving something that sounded to Americans like heresy. You could operate for weeks in enemy territory and never say a single word over the radio. Not because they had magic equipment, not because their sets were invisible or their frequencies secret, because they understood a brutal, simple fact American commanders refused to accept. The enemy was listening. The enemy understood English, and the enemy was using every word transmitted over American nets like a set of footprints. Fresh, wet, impossible to ignore. This is the story of radio discipline and the catastrophic lack of it. The story of how silence, real silence, enforced silence, became one of the deadliest differences between Australian and American operations in Vietnam. A difference so stark that a Navy SEAL would later say he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australian SAS than in all his previous training combined. And what he learned began with 2 words the Australians treated like religion: complete silence. Stay with me. The helicopter carrying Captain Daniel Mercer, U.S. Army liaison officer, the kind of man who wore fatigue sleeves rolled up like he was trying to convince the war he didn't bother him, descended through a pale morning haze toward Nui Jad in August of 1968. Mercer had 3 tours behind him already, 2 with conventional infantry, 1 with a shadowy advisory outfit that taught you how to speak softly and lie convincingly. He'd worked with South Vietnamese rangers who could move like ghosts through rice paddies. He'd seen Korean Marines who fought like they'd been carved from stone. He'd spent time around American special operations men who carried knives like they were extensions of their hands. He'd eaten dust and blood and stale coffee in enough places to believe he'd seen every flavor of war the Pentagon could brew. Then he met the Australians. Task Force headquarters wasn't what he expected. No grand humming operations center, no endless radio chatter, no fluorescent lit maps and cigarette-stained officers barking over grease pencils. The briefing room was small, sparse, practical. A map of Phuoc Toi covered one wall, pins in different colors marking things Mercer couldn't decode yet. Trails, suspected caches, villages that smiled at day and bled at night. 5 men sat around a table made from ammunition crates. None stood when Mercer entered. He'd been warned about Australian informality, told they didn't do the stiff theater Americans loved. But it wasn't the lack of salutes that hit him, it was the quiet. Not just the normal hush of soldiers when a stranger enters, something deeper. One man cleaned a weapon with a cloth so gentle it made no sound against metal. Another turned pages in a report with deliberate care, as if paper itself might betray them. A third sat so still Mercer wondered if he was asleep, but the man's eyes tracked Mercer's movement with an animal calm. The patrol leader, Sergeant Collins, lean as a wire and weathered like driftwood, finally acknowledged Mercer with a small nod. "You're coming with us tomorrow, Captain," Collins said, as if he were telling Mercer what time breakfast was. 5-man patrol, 3 days in the Hat Ditch. Mercer knew the Hat Ditch. Americans called it, with typical drama, the Iron Triangle of the South. 15 square kilometers of jungle and scrub where the Viet Cong seemed to appear from tree trunks and vanish into the soil. 3 U.S. battalions had tried to operate there and been systematically carved up. The area had been declared off limits to American ground forces since January, which in Vietnam meant, we go there anyway, but we try not to admit it. "What's the objective?" Mercer asked. "Recon," Collins said. "We go in, we watch, we report what we see." Mercer nodded automatically, standard. Then he added out of habit, "Radio checks every 12 hours? The Australians exchanged glances, not quite smiles, but something close, like men hearing someone ask if they plan to bring a piano on a hike. Collins leaned back. 2 scheduled comms windows over 72 hours, he said, both in Morse, 1-time pads, 90 seconds to transmit. Mercer blinked. 90-second total? That's it. If something happens, Mercer said, because his mind insisted on the doctrine, if we make contact, if we find something critical, "We break silence," Collins allowed, voice flat. "Otherwise the radio stays off." It contradicted everything Mercer had been taught about modern communications. American doctrine demanded constant contact. Platoon leaders checked in with company commanders every half hour. Company commanders reported to battalion on the hour. Battalion fed division, division fed corps, and somewhere far away, a general slept better because his radio told him the war hadn't wandered off without permission. The radio was an umbilical cord. Cutting it felt like madness. "What if you need support?" Mercer pressed. "Artillery, airstrikes, medevac." Collins didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just looked at Mercer the way you look at a man asking why you don't light a cigarette while soaked in gasoline. "Then we call for it," Collins said, "but we don't make noise until we need to." That night, Mercer lay on his bunk listening to distant rotors and insects, thinking of all the radios he'd heard in Vietnam, nets crackling at dawn with morning reports, status updates, weather, complaints, jokes, the casual intimacy of men talking into microphones as if they were alone, as if the jungle didn't have ears. The numbers told a grim story. Before deployment, one American division had recorded thousands upon thousands of communication security violations, soldiers using real names instead of call signs, giving positions in plain language, chatting about everything from the heat to last week's letter from home, and that was in training. In country, stress and fear turned discipline into a myth. Forward observers called out coordinates without encryption. Commanders transmitted plans hours before execution. Pilots described targets in language any competent listener could translate into death. The Army Security Agency had been screaming about it for years, filing reports that commanders read like bad news from a distant relative, acknowledged, then ignored. Mercer had seen classified intercept summaries. He knew what most line officers didn't want to know. The NVA and VC didn't just listen. They studied. They had linguists who understood American slang and military jargon. They had direction-finding equipment that could locate transmitters in minutes. They built patterns of life on American units. Who moved when, who checked in how often, what time helicopters came, which call signs meant which weapons. They were reading American radios like a book, and Americans kept turning the pages for them. They departed Nuijat in darkness. Mercer had been issued Australian kit, an L1A1 rifle, basic ammo, water, minimal rations. He still carried his own American radio, a PRC-25, because the US Army didn't know how to imagine a soldier without one. But Collins had been clear. "Your radio doesn't transmit unless I tell you," he said, "and I won't tell you." They moved in single file through the night, spacing wide enough to make Mercer's skin itch. American patrols stayed close enough for constant visual contact, tight enough to pass whispers and hand signals. These men moved with gaps so large Mercer kept losing sight of the man ahead. Yet what disturbed him more was what he didn't hear. No boots crunching, no webbing clinking, no labored breathing. The Australians moved like smoke. When the vegetation thickened, they didn't force through. They slowed to something nearly glacial, hands parting branches, bodies sliding around vines, everything placed back exactly as found, as if the jungle itself might notice disturbance and report it. 2 hours in, Collins raised a fist. The patrol froze. Mercer froze with them, one foot still in the air, thigh burning as he held position. 30 seconds passed, a minute. Somewhere, insects continued their endless song, indifferent. Collins's hand moved, subtle gestures Mercer couldn't interpret in the dark. The lead scout slid forward, swallowed by the black. 2 minutes later, he reappeared, touched Collins' shoulder 3 times. Then they moved again. Mercer wanted to ask what they'd stopped for. He wanted to ask what the signals meant, but asking required talking. And talking, Mercer was beginning to understand, was a kind of suicide. Dawn found them 6 kilometers inside the hat ditch. Collins selected a patch of dense undergrowth, and with no clearing and no obvious perimeter, the Australians established what Americans would call a patrol base, except there were no chopped fields of fire, no obvious fighting positions, no rotating guards. They simply melted into concealment, each man finding a view through leaves without disturbing the leaves. Then they waited. Mercer checked his watch. 0530. Back at American bases, radios would already be alive with reports. Companies checking in, battalion updating division, voices pouring into the air like confetti. Here, there was nothing. By 0800, Mercer was sure something was wrong, not tactically, but psychologically. 3 hours without radio contact violated every protocol his brain had built over years. His nerves begged for that crackle, that proof that the world still had structure. He pulled out a notebook, wrote a question, and slid it to Collins. "Shouldn't we check in?" Collins didn't answer with words. He tapped his watch and held up 5 fingers. 5 hours until the scheduled window. Until then, nothing. Mercer settled into the silence, and that's when he began to understand what the Australians had done. American patrols carried noise like a smell, radio hiss even when squelched, a handset click, the whispered radio check, the faint static burst. Even the restraint of trying to be quiet produced a signature. The Australians had eliminated the signature entirely. Their radios weren't on standby, they weren't turned low. They were off, dead. The jungle, without the constant whisper of friendly electronics, became a different world. Mercer heard the minute shift of leaves, the soft tick of insects, the distant cough of a monkey. He realized how much of the jungle he'd never heard because American radios had always filled the air with their own breath. A bird call repeated 3 times from the east. Collins pointed. The scout nodded. They'd identified the species, logged it as baseline. 20 minutes later, another bird call. Same shape, same pitch. But Collins stiffened. Mercer heard heard nothing wrong. To him, it was just jungle music. To Collins, it was a lie. The patrol shifted, rifles angled toward the sound. They waited. After 10 minutes, Collins relaxed. He leaned close enough that Mercer felt breath against his ear and whispered, the first word spoken in 8 hours. "You heard it," Collins murmured. "NVA patrol. 4, maybe 5. Signaling to each other." "How do you know?" Mercer whispered back before he could stop himself. Collins' eyes didn't move from the trees. "Wrong bird for this time of day," he said. "Intervals too regular. Human pattern, not animal." American doctrine would have called that contact, would have demanded an immediate report, would have triggered a chain of radio transmissions, support requests, coordination, all the things that made American power feel reassuring, and all the things that told the enemy exactly where you were. The Australians simply adjusted, shifted their route in their heads, and kept watching. The first scheduled comms window came at 1300. Collins pulled out a compact radio set, different from American models, with built-in procedures the US Army treated as optional. He wrote a message on a one-time pad, short and cryptic. When Mercer saw it, it looked like nonsense. Grids, numbers, letter codes meaningless without the key. At exactly 1300, Collins switched the radio on. He sent Morse. A brief acknowledgement came back, and then Collins switched it off again. Total transmission time, 47 seconds. Mercer stared. "That's it? That's it. They know what we saw?" "They know enough," Collins said. "They know we're operational. They know where we are, what we've observed. If they need more, they tell us next window." "And if something changes?" Mercer asked. "If we run into trouble before then?" Collins looked at him with something close to pity. "Captain," he said softly, "if we run into trouble, the whole province will know. We won't need a radio. They'll hear the gunfire." That night, Mercer learned the deeper value of silence. They were watching a trail junction suspected as a staging point. 3 hours they lay absolutely still, the kind of stillness that makes your joints ache and your mind start inventing reasons to move. Then came footsteps. 7 enemy soldiers moved along the trail with the easy confidence of men who believed the jungle belonged to them. They passed within 15 meters of the Australians. Mercer could see details, magazine pouches, the sweat line on collars, the casual way one man adjusted his sling. They were talking, normal volume, as if war was something that happened elsewhere. If this had been an American patrol, the protocol would have been clear. Observe, count, then call it in. Request permission to engage, ask for support, update higher. And the enemy, whether they understood every word or not, would have known someone was there. Their posture would change. They'd become alert, dangerous, unpredictable. The Australians did nothing. They watched, counted, memorized, and let the enemy pass through the night like fish through water, never realizing a hook hovered inches away. When the patrol vanished, Collins allowed himself the smallest smile. "Third group we've seen on this trail today," he whispered. "They're getting comfortable, sloppy." Mercer felt it settle into him then. What the Australians had built wasn't just a patrol, it was an intelligence machine that could exist in enemy territory indefinitely because the enemy never knew it was there. And the key wasn't camouflage, it was the refusal to speak into the air. Day 2 brought another lesson, one Mercer felt in his bones. A Huey gunship swept over their position low, rotors slapping the air. Mercer's instinct screamed, "Identify yourself." His hand went toward his radio, fingers already imagining the push to talk. Collins caught his wrist. "They're not looking for us," Collins said. "They're on their own mission." "What if they see movement?" Mercer whispered. "They won't," Collins said. "And if they do, they'll recognize our gear before they shoot. Turning the radio on does more harm than good." American doctrine would have argued otherwise. Positive identification prevented friendly fire. But Collins was calculating risk like a man who lived with different math. The chance of a helicopter seeing a well-hidden patrol was lower than the certainty that radio transmission created a beacon to anyone with ears and equipment. The Australians accepted risks Americans didn't have to because Americans could always lean on firepower. The Australians preferred not to be found at all. That evening, Mercer heard something that crystallized the difference. 4 kilometers away, an American convoy moved along Route 2. Mercer heard engines, the grind of diesel, then, faint but unmistakable, radio chatter carried through humid air. Squelch breaks, static bursts, voices. Even that far away, American radios made themselves known. Collins listened like a man hearing an enemy band tuning up. "Supply run," he said, heading toward Vung Tau. "They're talking about it on open channels," he added, almost disgusted. "Grid coordinates, times, routes. Might as well send the VC an engraved invitation to set up an ambush." Mercer thought of the American philosophy. If the enemy ambushes you, you call in artillery and air. You smash the ambush with weight and steel. You fight through with superior firepower. The Australians preferred to never be ambushed in the first place. The final comms window came on day 3. Again, one-time pad. Morse, 47 seconds. Then the radio disappeared back into waterproof wrapping like something dangerous. They moved toward extraction. What wasn't standard, even to Mercer now, was the silence maintained until the helicopter was nearly on top of them. Only then did Collins switch the radio on and transmit a brief signal to guide the aircraft in. No chatting, no unnecessary words. The ride back to Nui Jat took 20 minutes. Mercer spent it replaying the last 3 days in his head, realizing the scale of what he'd witnessed. 3 days of movement, surveillance, enemy proximity, and less than 6 minutes of total radio traffic. Now compare that to an equivalent American patrol. Radio checks every 30 minutes. That's 144 transmissions in 72 hours, each one a breadcrumb trail. Even if encrypted, each burst could be direction found. Each check-in created pattern, time, rhythm, predictability. The Australians created no pattern because they gave nothing to measure. Back at Nui Jat, Mercer debriefed with an Australian intelligence major who'd been running patrols like this for 2 years. Mercer asked the question that had been building since the briefing room. Do American units know about your procedures? The major shrugged. We've tried to share. Worked joint ops with SEALs, Special Forces, SOG types. Some get it. Most don't. Why not? The major's shrug was almost sympathetic. Their command structure won't allow it. American commanders need constant updates. If a patrol goes silent 12 hours, they panic. They assume something's gone wrong. They send quick reaction forces, air recon, make a bigger noise than anything the patrol would have made in the first place. Mercer understood then. The problem wasn't bravery, it wasn't intelligence, it wasn't even training. It was institutional hunger. An entire machine built on constant communication couldn't stop feeding without believing it would die. Mercer filed a report after his rotation. He wrote what he saw, compared Australian and American procedures, and reached conclusions that contradicted decades of doctrine. Radio discipline more than any other single factor determined patrol survival in denied territory. Silence wasn't a vulnerability, it was armor. The enemy could not ambush what they could not locate, and transmissions were the primary method of location. His recommendations were radical by American standards. Reduce scheduled checks, train Morse and encryption, enforce silence except in emergencies, punish violations like weapon safety failures. The report was noted, filed, and ignored, because implementing it required admitting an uncomfortable truth. American doctrine, built on communication and overwhelming firepower, had a fatal flaw against an enemy who could hear every word. A Navy SEAL chief named Rick Hayden learned the same lesson in 1968 during a 10-day joint operation with Australian SAS in the Rung Sak Special Zone. Hayden was no rookie, multiple tours, the kind of man who carried confidence the way others carried cigarettes. Then he spent 10 days with the Australians. For 10 days, the Australians didn't say a word unless absolutely necessary. Not on radio, not to each other. They communicated through hand and arm signals, dozens upon dozens of them. Signals for halt, danger, enemy count, direction change, weapon types, movement, all clear. An entire language that lived in muscle memory. American units used hand signals too, but as punctuation. The Australians used them as grammar. Hayden later said he thought it was excessive at first, overcautious. Then he realized that in territory where American units were getting hit every time they went out, they never got ambushed, never took fire, because nobody knew they were there. That wasn't luck, it was a system, and the numbers reflected it. Australian SAS ran roughly 1,000+ patrols over their Vietnam years with remarkably low combat losses. Meanwhile, American radio men kept dying at rates so steep their life expectancy was spoken of in seconds, 5, 6, 30. The exact number didn't matter. Everyone knew the job was cursed. The irony was almost cruel. The Australians carried radios too, sometimes better, sometimes worse than American sets, but they carried them off. The radio wasn't their voice, it was their last resort. American commanders couldn't comprehend that approach. In planning sessions, their questions always came fast. What if you need fire support? What if you run into trouble? What if the mission changes? The Australian answer never changed. If we need support, we call for it. If we're in trouble, you'll hear it. If the mission changes, tell us next window. To Americans trained to believe control required constant contact, silence felt like chaos. To Australians trained to believe noise was death, silence was order. Captured enemy documents proved the VC and NVA understood the difference better than anyone. They relied on American radio traffic like fishermen rely on tides. They could identify units by call signs, operators by voice. Their direction finders could point to transmitters like compass needles to north. And in Phuoc Tuy, the VC had their own grim saying about Allied forces. Americans could be defeated because they depended on artillery and air. Australians were avoided because they lived in the jungle like spirits. The VC called them phantoms, men who appeared without warning, watched without being seen, and vanished without trace. A large part of that phantomhood was not camouflage, it was not speaking into the air. The Americans tried, in fits and starts, to fix the problem. Programs analyzed intercept vulnerabilities, recommended better encryption, stricter procedures, frequent changes of call signs, limiting traffic. The recommendations were sound, and mostly ignored, because discipline is easy on paper and hard when your hands shake and your friends are bleeding and your commander demands a check-in right now, because it's easier to build a bigger radio, a better cipher, a new gadget than it is to change a culture. And American culture in the 1960s worshipped the radio. The belief that more communication meant better control was embedded in everything from training to promotions. A commander measured competence by the volume of information flowing into his operations center. Silence looked like failure, even when silence saved lives. The Australians had been shaped differently, by older wars and older lessons, by traditions that prized stealth and independence, by hard experience in jungles where you either learned to disappear or you got buried. So in Vietnam, American radio operators kept keying microphones every 30 minutes, sending call signs and grids and status reports into the humid air. And enemy signals intelligence operators kept listening, plotting, directing, setting ambushes like traps along invisible trails of sound. And the life expectancy of the American radio man remained measured in seconds. Meanwhile, in the same jungle, under the same canopy, Australian patrols moved in complete silence, unseen and unheard, proving there was another way. The lesson was there, bright as a flare for anyone willing to look. In the jungle, noise is death. And radio transmissions are the loudest noise you can make. Sometimes invisibility is more powerful than firepower. Sometimes the best communication is no communication at all. The Australians understood that. And because they did, they survived, when others, speaking too freely into the air, became coordinates waiting to be solved.